The hum of the environmental controls was a constant, low thrum against the vast, indifferent silence of the Antarctic plateau. It was a familiar sound, a dull counterpoint to the sharper click of my keyboard and the rustle of ancient charts. For Arthur Blake, a man whose life revolved around the whispers of long-dead civilizations, this remote outpost was less a prison and more a sanctuary. Here, the world's noise faded, leaving only the stark, beautiful clarity of ice and forgotten time. My hands, calloused from fieldwork despite the academic leanings of my role, moved with a practiced precision over the digital scans of geological core samples. My current obsession wasn't a lost Sumerian epic or a forgotten Mayan codex, but something far older, far more unsettling. Anomalous geological formations discovered deep beneath the ice sheet. The station's primary mission was climatological, but a series of seismic shifts had revealed pockets of pre-Cambrian rock, pushed up through younger strata in ways that defied conventional tectonics. It was the sheer impassability of their geological context that had drawn me in. My colleagues, mostly geologists and glaciologists, saw curiosities. I saw a story waiting to be deciphered, a language written in stone not by men, but by something else entirely. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shifting light outside my small lab window, a pale smear of sun that never quite set or rose. My diet was functional, my sleep minimal. Every waking moment was dedicated to these rocks. Their crystalline structures, when magnified, showed patterns that hinted at an underlying order, an unnatural symmetry that felt deliberate. I'd spent countless hours correlating these patterns with known geological stress points, searching for any terrestrial explanation and coming up blank. Then came the call. Not a direct one, but a message relayed through the station's communication officer. A routine survey drone, probing a newly formed crevasse, had detected an anomaly. Not geological, not thermal, but something else. A pattern of energy that the automated systems couldn't classify. A team had been dispatched to investigate, but the location was deep, requiring access through a series of disused passages. "It's a tight squeeze, Arthur," the expedition leader had warned me, his voice crackling over the intercom. Old access routes, abandoned utility tunnels from the original station construction, haven't been used in decades. Some of the bracing is questionable. I felt a prickle of anticipation, a sensation that transcended mere intellectual curiosity. This wasn't just a rock formation. It was a door. I gathered my equipment, my specialized optical scanner, a field tablet, an array of spectral analysis tools. The air outside the station's main complex bit at my exposed skin, even through my insulated gear. The entrance to the abandoned utility tunnels was a heavy, rusted hatch, almost swallowed by a drift of snow. The air inside was still and frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of decay and disuse. My breath plumed instantly, thick and white. "All right, Professor Blake," the engineer grunted, finally wrenching the hatch open. "After I. Just try not to touch anything unstable." The tunnels were a skeletal maze of corroded pipes, dormant conduits, and forgotten machinery. My headlamp cut a narrow cone through the gloom, illuminating decades of dust and the occasional glint of frost on exposed metal. Each step I took echoed, the crunch of ice under my boots amplified in the confined space. We navigated the labyrinth for what felt like an eternity, squeezing through narrow sections where rusted valves jutted out like skeletal fingers. The engineer pointed out patched cracks in the concrete, structural supports that groaned under the immense weight of the ice above. My mind, usually focused on the abstract, couldn't help but register the very real, very present danger of collapse. But the urgency of the discovery pulled me forward. Finally, the tunnels opened into a vast, cavernous space. My headlamp beam, now joined by those of my companions, struggled to penetrate the sheer scale of it. "There," the junior researcher breathed, his voice hushed with awe. He pointed a trembling finger towards a section of rock face, exposed by a recent ice melt. My breath hitched. My archaeolinguist's eyes, trained to find patterns in chaos, to discern meaning in the most obscure of marks, instantly locked onto them. They were unlike anything I had ever encountered. Not cuneiform, not hieroglyphs, not even the most abstract pictograms of forgotten proto-languages. These were not symbols to be read, but concepts made manifest. Lines didn't just meet. They implied impassable intersections, angles that suggested more than 3 dimensions. Curves defied Euclidean geometry, twisting back on themselves in ways that felt fundamentally wrong to my perception. My mind, a finely tuned instrument for deciphering human communication, found no purchase here. It wasn't a script. It was a fissure in understanding. My meticulously ordered world, built on the predictable laws of physics and the finite history of human endeavor, began to waver. These glyphs, ancient beyond human reckoning, seemed to hum with a silent, terrible knowledge. They suggested forms, structures, relationships that my brain simply refused to process. They saw shapes, strange marks. I saw something that had patiently waited for millennia beneath the ice, a silent utterance from a reality that had no business touching ours. And now I had found it. I had opened the door. The engineer and the junior researcher stood silent beside me, their own faces illuminated by their headlamps, reflecting a mixture of confusion and unease. I saw something that had patiently waited for millennia beneath the ice, a silent utterance from a reality that— I cut the thought short. Logic demanded more data. My determination, a familiar, comforting burn, pushed back the nascent dread. This was the find of a lifetime. We spent the next few hours meticulously documenting the formation. The junior researcher, meticulous with her camera, captured every angle, every shadow. The engineer, with his portable laser scanner, mapped the impassable contours, the rock itself an anomaly, a pre-Cambrian intrusion into a glacial epoch. I needed to be alone with them, not physically, not yet, but with their images, their data. Our temporary research hub, a repurposed section of the abandoned utility tunnels, offered a kind of monastic solitude. Concrete walls, stained with decades of forgotten leaks, stretched into the gloom, lit intermittently by the hum of emergency generators. My workspace was a small alcove, carved out with temporary partitions, a folding table burdened with my laptop, a scanner, and stacks of geological reports. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten machinery and the rhythmic drone of distant pumps, that I began the true work. I projected the high-resolution images of the glyphs onto a portable screen, illuminating the rough texture of the rock, the subtle variations in depth and width of each mark. My fingers, calloused from years of tracing ancient tablets, hovered over the digital reproductions. These were not scratches. They were deliberate, deeply incised, almost grown into the rock, as if the stone itself had been persuaded to articulate. My initial approach was systematic. I cross-referenced the glyphs against every known linguistic database, every symbolic system, every dead language I had ever studied. Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Indus Valley script, Rongo, the undeciphered scripts of Mesoamerica, nothing. Not even a tangential resemblance. The forms defied categorization. They weren't ideograms, nor phanograms, nor logograms. They were something else. One glyph in particular held my gaze. It resembled a knot, but a knot tied in 3 dimensions that seemed to fold back on itself in ways that made no spatial sense. It suggested an impassable geometry, a curve that was simultaneously concave and convex, a line that intersected itself without crossing. My mind, trained in the rigid logic of human language, stumbled. It was like trying to describe a color that didn't exist, using only the spectrum of visible light. Hours blurred into a single, intense focus. My eyes burned, but I couldn't look away. The more I stared, the more the glyph seemed to shift, subtly, at the periphery of my vision. A pattern I had just observed would, upon a second glance, seem to have reconfigured itself. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, dismissing it as eye strain, the fatigue of an obsessive mind. Yet the sensation persisted. The faint hum of the utility tunnels seemed to deepen, to take on a resonance that vibrated not just in the air, but within my skull. I tried to apply the principles of archaeolinguistics, searching for repetition, for a grammatical structure, for any underlying logic. But the glyphs marked my efforts. Their arrangement seemed random, yet imbued with an undeniable, terrifying coherence. It was as if they were speaking, but in a language designed to break the very concept of speech. I shivered, pulling my parka tighter. My breath hitched. No, it was the light, just the light. A faulty ballast. The tunnels were old, the infrastructure failing. My mind was simply connecting dots that weren't there, eager to find meaning in the unprecedented. This was the thrill of discovery, I told myself, the exhilaration of confronting the utterly unknown. It twisted the senses, played tricks on the mind. It was a natural reaction to such a profound deviation from the expected. But as I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching the cool glass of the screen, another sensation bloomed. Not just unease, but a profound, undeniable sense of presence. It wasn't a physical presence, no sound of movement, no change in the air pressure. It was a mental one, an awareness that the glyphs weren't merely static etchings, but a conduit, a key, and through that key, something was beginning to look back. I saw something that had patiently waited for millennia beneath the ice, a silent utterance from a reality that defied every principle I held sacred. My breath fogged the frigid air, but it wasn't the cold that made my lungs ache. It was the sudden, crushing weight of an impassable truth. We need to document this, I finally managed, my voice a rasp. Every single line, every curve, carefully, and then we need to extract a sample. The engineer, a man of practicalities and measurements, nodded slowly. It'll be delicate work, Arthur. This rock is ancient, brittle, and the ice around it, unstable. He glanced at the junior researcher, whose eyes were still fixed on the shimmering wall of glyphs, a flicker of something akin to fear in their depths. I barely heard him. My mind was already racing, cataloging, comparing. These weren't carvings. They were growths, somehow integral to the very stone, as if the rock itself had dreamed them into existence. Over the next few days, a meticulous, painstaking process began. We set up lights, tripods, and scanning equipment. The junior researcher, despite their initial apprehension, proved invaluable in operating the imaging devices, capturing high-resolution photographs and 3D scans of the entire formation. The engineer, with his steady hands and keen eye for structural integrity, oversaw the careful chiseling and extraction of several smaller, intact sections of the inscribed rock. He worked with a precision that bordered on reverence, sensing, perhaps, the profound strangeness of our discovery. During those days, I ate little, slept less. My cot in the cramped research station felt like a distant memory. I spent every waking moment either observing the extraction or poring over the initial scans, my fingers tracing the impassable geometries on the tablet screen. The others spoke in hushed tones, their conversations drifting to the sheer age of the find, the implications for human history. But they didn't see what I saw. They saw antiquity. I saw an abyss. To dedicate myself fully away from the constant, though well-meaning, interruptions, I secured permission to set up a dedicated analysis station in a section of the base's abandoned utility tunnels. I dragged in a folding table, a high-intensity lamp, and my collection of linguistic texts, turning the dusty space into a makeshift sanctum. The low hum of distant machinery was the only sound, a dull counterpoint to the buzzing in my own skull. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten functions, I began my true work. I laid out the extracted rock samples, their surfaces a tapestry of alien script. I projected the high-resolution scans onto a portable screen, zooming in on individual glyphs, trying to find a pattern, a recurring motif, anything that might hint at a linguistic structure. My comparative philology atlases lay open, their pages filled with cuneiform, hieroglyphs, linear, and be all human attempts to codify reality. These new symbols marked them all. They seemed to fold in on themselves, to suggest dimensions that my eyes could not quite grasp, like looking at a shadow cast by something that didn't have a solid form. The first oddity was subtle, almost imperceptible. As I stared at the projected glyphs, my eyes burning from the lamp's glare, I'd catch a fleeting distortion at the edge of my vision. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and everything would snap back to normal. Fatigue, I told myself, and the strain of constant focus. The air in these tunnels was stale, too. It was easy to imagine things. Then came the sounds. Faint at first, like the echoes of water dripping in a distant pipe, but irregular. Sometimes I'd hear a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to emanate not from the walls, but from within my own skull. I'd snatch my head up, listening intently, but the abandoned utility tunnels would fall silent, save for the hum of the base's life support systems, a dull, reassuring counterpoint to the growing unease. My mind, I reasoned, was playing tricks on me, starved for human interaction, overstimulated by the impossible task before it. The dreams, though, were harder to dismiss. They began as vivid bursts of color and shape, swirling geometries that refused to resolve into anything familiar. Then they grew more coherent, more insistent. I found myself navigating structures that defied perspective, rooms that folded in on themselves, hallways that led back to where they began, yet were somehow different. There were no people in these dreams, only space, vast and incomprehensible, filled with the glyphs I spent my waking hours studying. I'd try to sketch them, to capture the essence, but the moment my pen touched paper, they'd flatten, lose their terrifying depth, becoming mere lines. Stress. I muttered aloud to the empty tunnels, my voice sounding thin and reedy. Extreme isolation. Lack of sleep. It's all just my mind unraveling under the pressure. I believed it, or tried to. It had to be. The alternative. The alternative was a thought too monstrous to entertain. I picked up another rock sample, its surface cool beneath my fingertips, and leaned closer to the lamp, determined to break its silent code. The glyphs held the key, and I was going to find it. The engineer's words, a low rumble about brittle rock and unstable ice, faded into the hum of the excavation equipment. I barely registered them. My gaze, like the junior researchers, remained fixed on the wall of glyphs, though what I saw was fundamentally different. Where he likely saw ancient marks, I felt the pull of a language, a monstrous grammar unfurling itself within my own mind. Fear, I supposed, was the raw flicker in his eyes. For me, it was something else entirely, a hunger. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of study. The other researchers, once colleagues, became indistinct shapes moving at the periphery of my focus. I ate when I remembered, slept only when my body threatened to collapse, and even then, my dreams were a kaleidoscope of impassable angles and non-Euclidean spaces, each symbol a key turning in a lark I hadn't known existed. The expedition leader, a stern woman with a perpetually creased brow, tried to suggest a rotation schedule. I simply nodded, promising to comply, then found myself back before the shimmering rock face moments later, a magnet drawn to a pole. The engineer, a man of quiet observations, stopped trying to engage me in conversation. He'd just shake his head, a slight tremor in his jaw, and return to his structural assessments. The junior researcher, meanwhile, actively avoided me, his glances quick and furtive, as if my very presence radiated an unsettling cold. My isolation was complete, a hollowed-out space where only the glyphs and I existed. I ran my fingers over the cold stone, tracing the lines that defied any known geometric principle. They weren't just etched, they felt impressed, as if the rock itself had buckled under the weight of concepts too vast for its material form. My initial attempts at cataloging and comparison had fallen apart. No Proto-Sumerian, no Rongo-Rongo, no Indus Valley script offered even the faintest echo. These symbols were unique, self-referential, a closed system of meaning that demanded a complete rewiring of my cognitive pathways. But the rewiring was happening. I started to see the connections. Not logical, linear connections, but resonant ones. A symbol that initially seemed to represent pressure would, when viewed in proximity to another, suddenly imply unfolding. And that unfolding wasn't a physical process, but a conceptual one, a transformation of state across dimensions I couldn't yet name. It was like learning a language whose words changed meaning based on the speaker's unspoken intent, a language of pure, unadulterated being. One afternoon, hunched over my notes in the auxiliary research tent, the fluorescent lights above flickered, not in a mechanical fault, but with a subtle, rhythmic throb. It was too fast to be a real flicker. A kind of afterimage burned onto my retina, a ghost in the light. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. It seemed to come from just behind my left ear, though when I whipped my head around, there was nothing but the canvas wall. The sound left a residue, a faint vibration in my inner ear, a phantom echo of something almost said. These were not hallucinations. These were signals. The glyphs weren't just describing these concepts, they were manifesting them. My breakthrough, I felt, was imminent. I was on the precipice of understanding, of grasping the fundamental truth these symbols contained. But the precipice was crumbling beneath my feet. The expedition leader found me later that day, still in the tent, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to sketch a particularly complex glyph. "Arthur," she began, her voice unusually soft, "you need to rest. You look unwell." I looked up, meeting her gaze. Her face seemed to ripple just for a moment, like a reflection in disturbed water. Her features elongated, then snapped back into place. I blinked. "Unwell," I repeated, my voice hoarse. "I'm closer than ever. I can feel it. They're not just symbols there. Instructions, a blueprint for a different kind of reality." She stared at me, her expression hardening into something I couldn't quite decipher. Concern, yes, but also a sliver of fear. Instructions for what, Arthur? I hesitated. How could I explain? How could I articulate the sensation of the world subtly reknitting itself around me, the way the very air seemed to thicken with unspoken presences? For seeing, I finally managed. For truly seeing what's always been here. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything else, just turned and left the tent, the flap sealing behind her with a soft thwack. I knew then that I was truly alone in this. My colleagues were no longer sources of support, but obstacles, their conventional minds blind to the shifting truth. Not in my bunk, not in the common area, but in the deeper, forgotten parts of the facility. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and disused machinery, a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. Pipes, thick with frost and rust, snaked along the low ceiling, some dripping a slow, rhythmic plink into unseen puddles. Here, away from the watchful eyes and the conventional understanding of the others, I could truly think, truly feel the glyph's influence. I pulled out my notebook, the pages filled with my increasingly frenzied sketches. My fingers traced the lines, the impassable angles, and as I did, a new pattern emerged, not on the page, but in the very fabric of the tunnel around me. The rhythmic plink of water morphed into something else, a layered sound, like multiple drips falling at slightly different, yet perfectly synchronized, intervals forming a subtle, unsettling rhythm. It was a language not of sight or sound, but of pure perception. The glyphs were not merely symbols of the unseen, but conduits to it, and something was waiting on the other side, something that had always been here. The thwack of the tent flap was a finality, a door slamming shut not on a conversation, but on any lingering hope of shared understanding. The colleague's face, tight with a blend of concern and thinly veiled dismissal, had etched itself into my memory. They saw a man unraveling. I saw a truth they were too comfortable to acknowledge. Alone. That was the only way forward now. I gathered my notes, the heavy, water-damaged folios, and the carefully wrapped fragments of the carved rock. The main research tent, with its humming generators and the distant clatter of the mess hall, suddenly felt like a cage, its walls too thin, too permeable. I needed a space where I wouldn't be observed, where the raw edges of my work wouldn't be judged by conventional eyes. My gaze fell upon the access panel leading to the abandoned utility tunnels, a labyrinth of rusted pipes and disused conduits that snaked beneath the station. No one ventured there unless absolutely necessary. It was perfect. With a grunt, I unlatched the heavy steel door and descended into the cold, damp air. The tunnels were a forgotten artery, smelling of ozone, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of disuse. My headlamp cut a stark beam through the perpetual twilight, illuminating a world of spiderwebs, dust motes, and 1,000 shadows. I found a relatively dry alcove, clear of major pipework, and set up a small folding table. I spread out the rubbings of the glyphs, their impassable angles and non-Euclidean curves marking the linearity of my thoughts. As I traced a particularly complex sequence with my finger, a flicker caught my eye. It wasn't in the lantern light, but deeper, in the periphery of the beam. Not a sway, not a wobble, but a deliberate, crawling movement, like something unseen was pulling at its edges. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I forced my attention back to the glyphs, trying to translate a recurring symbol that seemed to denote an impassable spatial relationship. I reached for my thermos of lukewarm tea, my fingers brushing against the plastic casing of my voice recorder. For a fraction of a second, the recorder seemed to elongate, stretching like soft clay, its buttons rippling into indistinct mounds before snapping back to its familiar, solid form. My hand froze. I stared at the recorder, then at my hand, then back at the recorder. It was perfectly normal, an unremarkable piece of equipment. My mind scrambled for an explanation. The flickering lantern, a trick of the eye, I picked it up, turned it over. Solid, unyielding. Yet, I had seen it. The memory was sharp, visceral. The tunnels, with their endless, repetitive patterns of pipes and wires, began to feel less like a haven and more like a maze designed to break me. I stood, stretching my legs, needing to move. I walked down a short passage, intending to reach a junction I remembered from an earlier, brief exploration. The passage felt longer than it should have been. The pipes overhead, usually a uniform rust brown, seemed to shimmer with an oily, iridescent sheen in places, then revert to dull rust. I reached the junction, but it wasn't the junction I remembered. Instead of the familiar three-way split, there was a sharp, almost right-angled turn, leading into a section of tunnel I had never seen before. The walls here were smoother, newer, the conduits sleek and silver, not the pitted, corroded metal I'd come to expect. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. This wasn't right. I had walked these tunnels before, mapping them in my mind, searching for a suitable workspace. This section was new, or had it always been here, simply unseen? I spun around, retracing my steps, trying to find the familiar junction, the path back to my alcove. The tunnel behind me now seemed to undulate slightly, the concrete walls breathing in and out, imperceptibly at first, then with a sickening fluidity. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't an optical illusion. The world around me was becoming malleable. The cold metal felt solid, real, a desperate anchor in a fracturing reality. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The new section of tunnel was gone, replaced by the familiar three-way junction. My alcove was just a short walk away. I stumbled back, collapsing onto my stool, my hands trembling as I tried to organize the rubbings. The glyphs, once fascinating, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were the very source of this unraveling. My mind, a carefully constructed edifice of logic and reason, was cracking. I was losing my grip, slipping into a madness born not of internal failing, but of external, impassable truth. I walked down a short passage, intending to reach a junction, but the path ahead was blocked by a cave-in of rusted conduits and concrete dust. No clear way through. The air, heavy with the metallic tang of decay and the faint, sweet rot of something organic, pressed in on me. I turned back, my boots scraping on the grit-strewn floor, the sound echoing too loudly in the confined space of the abandoned utility tunnels. Every drip of condensation from the overhead pipes, every groan of shifting metal, felt amplified, invasive. My head throbbed, a dull pulse behind my eyes, a constant reminder of the glyphs, of the impassable images they had etched into my mind. I found a relatively clear alcove, tucked beside a massive, defunct ventilation shaft. The air here was marginally cleaner, though still thick with the dust of ages. I set down my worn satchel, pulling out the carpet fragments of the glyphs, my notes, and the small, flickering lantern that cast dancing shadows across the crumbling walls. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I arranged the papers. This was it. I had to push through. The fragmented visions, the sense of something vast and unseen, they were whispers. I needed clarity, definition. I needed to understand what was trying to emerge. My gaze fell on a particular sequence I'd been wrestling with for days. 3 symbols, repeated in a staggered pattern. One resembled an inverted pyramid, but its base seemed to curve inward, impassably. Another was a series of concentric circles, yet they appeared to recede into a point before their center, defying all perspective. The third was the most troubling, a jagged line that seemed to intersect itself without ever actually crossing, an infinite loop compressed into a finite space. I traced the inverted pyramid with my finger, the faint ink bleeding slightly under the pressure. I'd interpreted it initially as a concept of descent or foundation, but the inward curve, it wasn't just a symbol for depth, it was depth warped. My mind had always tried to flatten it, to force it into a familiar geometric framework. But what if the framework itself was the problem? What if the glyph didn't represent a known dimension, but a relationship between dimensions, one that our perceptions simply couldn't process? I remembered a brief notation I'd made weeks ago, a half-formed thought about the negative space around the glyphs, how it seemed to breathe. I pulled out the page, scrawled with hurried, almost illegible script. The absence defines the presence. I looked at the glyphs again, the concentric circles that receded before their center. It wasn't about a vanishing point in the distance. It was about a vanishing point within the object itself, a spatial paradox, a place that existed by not existing in the way we understood. My breath hitched, and the jagged, self-intersecting line, not a path, but a boundary that folded in on itself, creating an interior that was also an exterior, a surface that contained infinite points, yet occupied no discernible space. It hit me then, a sickening jolt of recognition that felt like a physical blow to my skull. These weren't symbols for objects or actions. They were symbols for principles. Principles that governed a reality utterly different from our own. A geometry where lines could converge without meeting, where space could fold into itself, where direction was relative not to an external observer, but to an internal, impassable vector. A reality where the concept of inside and outside held no meaning. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, overwhelming intellectual assault. My brain, trained for decades in linear thought, in Euclidean certainty, was trying to process an impassibility. It was like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup, and the teacup was my very mind. The air in the abandoned utility tunnels grew impassably still. The faint hum of distant, living machinery, usually a comforting backdrop, died. The flickering lantern flames stretched, elongated, then snapped back, as if struggling against an unseen current. Then the walls. They didn't move, not physically, but my perception of them shifted. The grimy concrete, the exposed conduits, the peeling paint, they all seemed to shimmer, to vibrate at a frequency I couldn't quite grasp. The flat, solid surface of the wall across from me began to ripple, not like water, but like a sheet of impassable fabric, folding and unfolding in dimensions I couldn't comprehend. For a terrifying, endless moment, the mundane concrete dissolved. I didn't see through it. I saw into it. I saw structures, colossal, geometric forms that twisted and turned in ways that made my eyes ache, my stomach lurch. They were vast, impassably vast, stretching away into an incomprehensible distance, yet simultaneously contained within the small section of the tunnel wall. They were made of angles that defied measurement, curves that bent back on themselves, surfaces that were both solid and transparent. And within those structures, or perhaps, as those structures, there were presences, not figures, not creatures, but vast, echoing intelligences. They weren't looking at me, but they were aware in a way that didn't require sight or sound. They were simply there, interwoven with the impassable geometry inherent to its fabric, waiting, not for me specifically, but for something, for the veil to thin, for mine to open. A scream tore from my throat, raw and involuntary, shattering the impassable stillness. The vision snapped back. The concrete wall was just a wall again, grimy and solid. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The lantern flickered erratically. But the echo of what I had seen, the indelible imprint of impassable geometry and vast, patient awareness, remained seared behind my eyelids. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle. I had deciphered it. I had understood. And the understanding had ripped a hole in the fabric of my sanity, revealing the true scale of what lay beyond the comfortable illusion of reality. I was no longer Arthur Blake, linguist. I was a door standing ajar, and something vast had just peered through. The concentric circles, receding before their center, a vanishing point within the object itself. The concept settled behind my eyes not as an idea, but as a cold, invasive presence. I felt it worming through the channels of my mind, not just understanding the paradox, but becoming it. A spatial corruption. The glyphs weren't merely symbols to be read. They were an entry point, a disease. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. No one else could see this. No one else should see this. To share it would be to spread the infection, to invite the distortion into their own ordered realities. My colleagues, my peers, they were anchors to a world I could no longer fully inhabit. Their questions, their well-meaning skepticism, their insistence on linear time and Euclidean space would only muddy the waters, or worse, drag me back into a sanity that was, increasingly, a lie. I had to sever the connection. I started by ignoring communications. The blinking light on my terminal, the insistent vibration of my handheld device. Each unanswered ping felt like a tiny invasion. I told the project supervisor I needed uninterrupted solitude for a breakthrough, a necessary lie. He grumbled but acquiesced, accustomed to my eccentricities. But even his reluctant agreement felt laced with suspicion, a subtle judgment in his tone that I amplified in my mind until it became a sneering condemnation. I began to see their faces in the periphery of my vision, shadows lingering in doorways, a quiet conversation in the hallway morphing into a coded discussion about me. The world around me began to ripple. Not overtly, not yet. The air itself felt wrong. Sometimes it was too thin, like breathing in a vacuum, other times too thick, pressing in from all sides. There was a hum, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of existence, a chorus of presences just beyond the threshold of hearing. My small workspace, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, too exposed. Too many windows, too many doors. I needed a place where the existing reality was already tenuous, a forgotten corner of the world where the old rules held less sway. I remembered the abandoned utility tunnels beneath the facility, a labyrinthine network of crumbling concrete and rusted pipes, long disused and officially off-limits. Perfect. Its forgotten state, its disconnection from the facility's active systems, made it an ideal incubator for my burgeoning understanding. I gathered my notes, the translated fragments, the raw glyphic images, and a bare minimum of supplies. No one saw me go, or if they did, I convinced myself they merely observed, filing away my movements for later dissection. The descent into the abandoned utility tunnels was like stepping into a different stratum of time. The air grew heavy, smelling of damp earth and metallic decay. Every drip of water from an overhead pipe sounded like a deliberate footfall. Every scuttling sound of vermin became a clandestine approach. I started talking to myself, hushed explanations of the glyphs, rationalizing the bizarre, trying to impose order on a mind that was rapidly losing its grip. Here, in the absolute isolation of the abandoned utility tunnels, the distortions intensified. The pipes running along the ceiling seemed to writhe, their metallic surfaces momentarily shimmering with an impassable, oily sheen. The geometry of the tunnel itself would warp, perspectives shifting without warning. A straight section would suddenly appear to curve inward, a distant opening would recede and then snap closer, defying optical laws. They weren't watching me, they were simply there, an inherent part of this new, fractured reality I was uncovering. Their very existence was the infection. I knew then that my colleagues, the project supervisor, everyone I had left behind, couldn't merely hinder me. They were actively, if unknowingly, working against the truth. They were the unwitting agents of the old reality, the guardians of the veil. Their concern, if they ever came looking, would be a trap. Their attempts to help would be an attempt to reimpose the lie, to seal the door I was prying open. My isolation wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, a defense. The world outside, the world of straight lines and predictable outcomes, was dissolving, and I was the only one left to witness its unmaking. The concentric circles, receding before their center, a vanishing point within the object itself. The concept had settled behind my eyes not as an idea, but as a cold, invasive presence. A spatia. A thing that shouldn't exist, yet did, now resided within my thoughts. The world, already tenuous, finally began to tear. I found myself in the abandoned utility tunnels, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale metal. My flashlight beam, a trembling spear, cut through the oppressive gloom, illuminating rusted pipes that snaked along the low ceiling like skeletal serpents. I wasn't sure how I'd arrived here, or when. The last clear memory was of my study, the faint glow of the deciphers on my screen. Then a lurch, a sickening twist in this. I had to understand. I had to see it through. But the abandoned utility tunnels were not just physical. They were a mirror to the twisting passages of my own mind. Was it the flickering light, or were the very walls breathing? A low hum vibrated through the concrete floor, not a sound I could hear, but a sensation that resonated in my bones. It was the glyphs, I realized, speaking without voice, without light, directly into the core of my being. Images flashed behind my eyes, unbidden, unholy. Not pictures I could describe, but impressions. Shapes that defied perspective, colors that were not colors, vastness, a crushing, indifferent vastness. The rough texture was real, solid, but the visions intensified. I saw the shadow of something colossal, not moving through space, but being space itself. It was ancient, older than stars, older than the concept of time. It didn't perceive me, or anything, in a way I could comprehend. It simply was. The glyphs were not just symbols. They were windows, or perhaps more accurately, keys. They were unlocking chambers in my perception, forcing me to see what had always been there, just beyond the spectrum of human awareness. I stumbled forward, my legs heavy, my mind a buzzing hive of alien concepts. The hum grew louder, sharper, coalescing into a single, overwhelming thought. Always here. Always. The truth, when it arrived, was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, agonizing dawn. It wasn't that these entities were coming. It wasn't that they were invading. They had never left. We, humanity, were the interlopers, the fleeting disturbances on a canvas they had always occupied. We simply lacked the faculties to perceive them, our senses too crude, our minds too limited. The glyphs, those impassable symbols, were the language of their existence, a blueprint for a reality that our brains were never meant to process. I collapsed against a stack of discarded conduit pipes, the metallic tang sharp in my nostrils. My breath hitched, not in a sob, but a guttural gasp that felt alien, torn from some other throat. The abandoned utility tunnels became a microcosm of the universe, a vast, intricate network, mostly unseen, mostly ignored, existing alongside our meager, brightly lit paths. My sanity was a threadbare curtain, now ripped to shreds. Dreams and reality had merged into a singular, horrifying tapestry. Had I been walking these tunnels for hours, days? Or had I never left my study, merely sinking deeper into the nightmare of my own opened mind? The distinction no longer mattered. The entities were not in my mind was in them. I could feel them now, not with touch or sound, but with a new, horrifying sense that had been born from the glyphs. A colossal eye that didn't see, a timeless thought that didn't think, a formless presence that simply was, and had always been. The horror wasn't their malevolence, but their absolute, cosmic apathy. We were less than dust motes to them. We were nothing. And I, Arthur Blake, had simply opened the door to this awareness. I had pulled back the veil, and now I could never unsee. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with them. They were everywhere, and they were listening, or perhaps they were just being. And I, wretched Arthur, was finally, truly awake.